Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this CogX session on the fascinating and important topic of data poisoning. My name is Nick Morris. I'm the CEO of CyLon, where our mission is to find and develop the security technologies of the future, working with outstanding entrepreneurs and innovators. I'm delighted to be joined today by two such outstanding innovators, both of whom are building and leading businesses to address this critical issue of data poisoning and the threat which it poses to AI systems, and as such to a potentially broad swathe of our future digital economy. First, I'm very pleased to introduce Neil Serebryany. Neil is the founder and CEO of CalypsoAI, a US-based company which has raised $15 million to date, with Neil himself holding multiple patents in the space of adversarial machine learning. And our second expert panelist today is David Sully. Dave is the founder of Advai, a recently launched London-based startup working to secure the future of AI, prior to which Dave worked in the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Neil also shares a relatively recent background in government on the US side, so I'm really looking forward to exploring that particular angle on things throughout our time today. Just before we really kick off, as Suki said, the format for today is very much a conversation. So to the audience, please do submit any questions you have at any point through the CogX platform, and I'll bring in as many as I can, either throughout the discussion where appropriate or at the end. So to kick off, I'd like to first focus on the problem here before we later move on to discuss solutions. So Neil, if I can come to you first. First, thank you very much for joining us from across the pond. I'm sorry that we can't be doing this together in person as we'd originally hoped. Perhaps I could ask you to begin with two things. So one, by giving us a very brief overview to what is data poisoning for the benefit of anyone in the audience who may not already know. But then more interestingly, what I'd really like to jump straight into is your perspective on what's the so what question here. So why this is a problem to which you've dedicated the last few years of your life and potentially, hopefully many more to come. So yeah, firstly, what is it? And secondly, so what? Why does it matter?
Nick, thanks so much for the introduction, and it's great to be with all of you. So data poisoning as a problem is quite simple. When you think about your machine learning model, at the end of the day, your machine learning model is fed by a training data set, and that training data set can be corrupted, whether by malicious means in the form of an adversarial machine learning attack, or via more benign means, via unfair bias of some sort. And the net effect of that is the decisions that you're getting out of your model are not those that you expected or hoped to get. Additionally, it's possible to have a model inversion attack where an attacker is stealing the data that was used to train your model, if it's trained on PII data of some sort or classified or sensitive data in any way, shape, or form. Fundamentally, the reason why we dedicate our time to this problem and the reason why we spend so much time thinking about threat intelligence in this space is because if you think about machine learning adoption and you think about the fact that 85% of machine learning projects never get to production, according to a recent Gartner report, one of the biggest reasons for that is this fear or this concern around, if I deploy my machine learning into production, how do I know it'll work as I expect it to work? How do I know that the results I get back are those that I expect to get back? And until we solve the security related challenges like data poisoning in the machine learning space, we're not going to see the full adoption of this technology and actual productionization of this technology that we're all relying on.
That's a really fascinating introduction. Thanks, Neil. We'll return to some of those points a little later. Dave, if I can bring you in here and actually pose the same question. How much of what Neil said resonates with you? What was it about this space that made you leave your job to take the leap into the murky waters of the startup world and to launch Advai late last year?
Yeah, basically, I couldn't agree more with everything that Neil's just said. I think he really clearly elucidated the whole problem. I think the bit that attracted me originally to the space was simply that when I was in government, I've heard for the last 5 to 10 years that AI is going to take over the world. And I think it has some amazing possibilities, and we're seeing some of those in action at the moment. But when you start looking into sort of like the elements of bias and poisoning and the security vulnerabilities that also come with AI systems, I suddenly realized that there's a whole lot there that's not really being explored. And it all comes down to the fact that it's so difficult to understand what these machines are doing when you've got a huge data set that's being used to train them. Often in the cases of something like, say, GPT-3, where you've got 175 billion parameters, there's no chance that a human can ever look at all of those and identify the issues. And that's a really attractive, really interesting problem set to go after.
Brilliant, thank you. And I guess to bring this to life, I guess people may be familiar with some of the more sort of commonly cited case studies here. So the sticky tape on a stop sign, which maliciously confuses a Tesla's autonomous driving systems, et cetera, et cetera. But you must have seen sort of countless others. So bring that to life for us a bit. What are the best examples, by which I guess I mean the most sort of threatening examples of this that you've seen yourselves? Who wants to go first on that one?
Sure, I'd be happy to take that one. So one example that we frequently like to talk about is within the cybersecurity realm. So many of your cybersecurity vendors are turning to machine learning based systems for detecting, system vulnerabilities, for detecting IoT vulnerabilities, and for detecting, malicious kind of attacks on your traditional computer systems. And there's a huge vulnerability there. It's enormously easy to attack the machine learning system itself or the machine learning classifier and use that as a way of getting into your traditional infrastructure. So it's not just a machine learning threat or a threat to your ML systems, but it's also a threat to your far, far wider aperture that makes up your kind of traditional security systems.
Great. And Dave, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think the way that I always look at this is just a traditional evolution of sort of asymmetric approaches that bad guys are always going to take. So they look at your technology and they identify the holes in that. And at the moment in AI and ML, that often comes across in the fact that, for example, you've got bias. Well, if you can identify where that bias sits in that machine, then that's an incredibly powerful thing that you can use. And it becomes even more powerful if you can inject that bias yourself through a poisoning attack. So if you look at, for example, if you're training on an open source data set, where's that data come from? How's it been put together? Can you completely trust that, for example? If somebody puts that into it now, are they able to abuse your system in the future? And I think when you're coming to sort of like the real world sort of examples, you've got elements of, say, poisoning. For example, the infamous one was Microsoft Tay, the chatbot, where, okay, Microsoft create this amazing chatbot that's designed to interact with the public and take that and learn from it and develop, but never actually consider the fact that as that's relearning and it's engaging with people who actually aren't particularly nice and putting in poisonous language, that it's going to take on those characteristics. And you've got all of these different problems that maybe people hadn't originally considered that are slowly sort of like feeding into this problem.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And one of the real world examples that we've talked about in the past, Dave, is about this sort of threat to something like, say, algorithmic sort of trading in the finance sector. Can you talk a little bit about that and how? I think that's a real world example which a lot of the audience will be familiar with to some extent or another. So I'd love to hear a bit more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, obviously. So algorithmic trading is obviously an area where a huge amount of money has been invested and a lot of effort, and some very, very clever people are looking at it. It's also taking very, very business critical decisions in a very rapid time frame. And that's sort of like a perfect sort of forum for an adversarial attack, if you like. And so you've got different opportunities there where you can potentially game the system. And so you've got scenarios potentially there where, say, if you can start getting together Twitter bots that will affect the algorithm in a certain way and affect a certain trade, then that obviously becomes very powerful if you're a bad actor. And interestingly, when you look at some of the attacks that are generated, they actually have the hallmarks of historic human attacks that were done and outlawed on the stock market in the past. So like I said, it's this evolution of technology, and it's not necessarily completely new techniques. Yes, the AI is obviously completely new and poisoning is completely new to us. But when you look at the techniques, it's actually not that dissimilar to the stuff that's happened in the past, as far as your asymmetric thinking and approach to the problem goes.
So sort of similar problems, but now with the bad actors just having a much more sort of developed and sophisticated toolkit, effectively. Which yeah, and I think that, you know, a word that jumped out to me from what you said, Neil, was this word sort of fear. That this threat and the sort of slightly uncertain nature of it is creating this fear from various different people. And I read in a blog post that you did yourself recently, talking about how AI projects, I believe it was in this context, it was from the US government side, were being abandoned for several reasons, all of which boil down to one word: fear. And I took from that you believe that governments and institutions are sometimes effectively more afraid of the negative consequences of something going wrong with these novel AI systems than they are enthusiastic of the sort of positive impact that they could have if things go right. So is that a fair summary? And is this problem therefore already holding us back? And I guess, do you think they've got the right balance at this point on that sort of risk-reward ratio trade-off?
It's a really good question. So to kind of, take one of Dave's points, when you're talking about an attack, you're not necessarily talking about totally corrupting the system. Rather, you're talking about introducing just enough disinformation or introducing just enough uncertainty that it's hard to trust the results of that system, which makes an attack far, far simpler to pull off. And then going back to this question of fear, I always like to look at it through the lens of traditional cyber, where if you look at the development of, your traditional enterprise kind of software enterprise technology, and you look at the failure rates for traditional enterprise technology around 1995 to 1998, what you'll end up seeing is that you had very, very similar failure rates. And it was only as the security industry kind of gained steam and, kept a field with some of your kind of offensive hackers that you were able to see, far fewer projects start to fail, and you were able to see comfort with actually deploying machine learning for mission critical systems, whether in the government realm where we're talking about classified or sensitive data, in the healthcare realm where we're talking about PII data, or in the financial services realm where we're talking about, personal data as well as your dollar, cents, pounds, and pound sterling.
Great. And Dave, is that word fear something that you'd echo from your experience over on this side of the world?
Yeah, I think that it's that. I'd say it's trust as well is the word that I'd go for. So the feedback that we've had, especially when you're looking at the defense sphere, is if you're asking somebody to potentially risk their life with an implemented system, and they see in a demonstration it works 90% of the time, but then something that for them looks completely obvious, but the system completely misses and it fails, they lose trust in that system instantly. And I think there's another element to that, which is AI is slightly different from, at least in this form, slightly different from traditional cybersecurity in that you're not, the way that it interacts with the world is not like a traditional traditional system in some ways. The way that the machine interprets the world is different from the humans. And in some ways, there's almost this way that you can play those two environments off against one another. Yeah. So where you overload the human instead of the machine. So you might as well show it something that the human goes, right, I've lost trust in this machine, I'm switching it off. You've achieved your objective. That it's, again, I keep on saying this word, asymmetric approaches.
Yeah. Basically. Yeah. So I completely get that from the sort of government perspective and how they're being, so I guess you might say that they're being prudent or understandably prudent, I suppose, in sort of how they view these technologies. I'd really be interested in your views, because it's a subject that I find really interesting, on how another sector is handling this, just briefly, and specifically tech, and perhaps even more specifically sort of big tech. Now, those organizations are, I think it's fair to say, less renowned for a sort of cautious approach, even if sort of move fast and break things is perhaps not quite as fated as it once was as a sort of business strategy. But how do you think those companies are handling their deployment of sort of AI-enabled, AI-powered technologies at this point? Are they giving due thought and credence, in your view, to the risks that we've been discussing? Neil, let's start with you.
Yeah, certainly. That's a great question. I think that when you look at your kind of large technology companies and you look at A, the data sets that they're dealing with, and B, how they're thinking about it from a kind of information security perspective, oftentimes they're looking at certain new ways of creating machine learning models, where they're looking at how do you create synthetic training data sets that are cleared of some of the potential biases or attacks that might be incumbent in kind of a publicly available data set. And two, they're looking to understand what is the latest kind of and greatest state-of-the-art security technology in the machine learning space.
Great. And Dave, obviously we have a sort of, our tech landscape is not quite the same over here as it is in the US, but what would you add to that? What's been your perspective?
Yeah, I think the Gartner report that Neil referenced earlier is a really good representation in general of how large companies are investing a large amount of money in AI, but then that fear factor is holding them back from that deployment. So they are getting caught on that, it seems. I think there's a recognition that AI offers them a huge amount of potential, but it's always that bad effect that's not been considered in the past. And that's really coming into a lot of the debates. All of this is the same playing field as ethics and bias and all of the stuff that's being discussed across CogX. And I think all of these things are playing on their minds. I think that there's also sort of a huge reliance on data scientists to get it right and perfect first time pre-deployment. You've got to get the perfect data set that's completely unbiased. You've got to make the right assumptions. You've got to get that into deployment. Can you imagine that's a lot of stress going on there for them? And there's not that many tools for actually addressing all of these problems as well. So it's a big challenge.
Yeah. So it feels like, at the risk of oversimplifying, it feels to me that we're saying there are sort of two risks at the sort of very top sort of macro level. That one, people, companies, institutions, governments are so scared about data poisoning and this risk that they don't deploy technologies at all that could be otherwise be to all of our benefits. And two, that people do deploy these technologies and they go wrong, obviously with direct consequences to that system in question, and likely indirect consequences or secondary consequences in undermining general confidence in the sector in the future. So now that we've sort of set the scene and depressed everybody about how big a problem that those things sort of could be, I'd like to move on to the more positive side of things. So how do we fix it? And what I find really interesting is that you've both come across this problem clearly while working within government, but you've both left government in order to solve it. But I'd like to start there with your previous employers, if I may, and draw in your insights on both the US and UK take on this in particular. So what do you think government's role should be in addressing this? And are they doing a good job of it at the moment? Dave, I'll come to you first on this one.
Here we go. Time to burn all of my bridges. I think this is an incredibly complex area. And actually, referring back to sort of that point about data scientists having to get everything right, I think actually the burden shouldn't be on companies and data scientists to take all of the decisions that we're sometimes asking them to take. And if we get outside of poisoning and we get to say things like bias and ethics and so on, it might not necessarily be your data scientist or your company might not necessarily be the right place to be taking that sort of decision on ethics, for example. And that's where traditionally society, democracy, governments kind of step in. And I think that whole responsible AI piece, and if you look at the work that the EU is doing in its AI white papers, if you look at the ISO standards that are coming through, that's the type of thing that's historically played a really, really important part. And actually, if it's done right, then that regulation can be really beneficial because it gives everybody those guidelines and those parameters to operate within. But it's going to, and this is talking from a historical government perspective, that interaction between government and industry is always tricky, and it's going to take a lot of hard work from a lot of people who are interested in that subject and well-meaning, I think, to actually achieve that.
Yeah, I won't press you to expand too much further on that, as you said, so you can maintain some of your important relationships. But to expand on one thing that you mentioned, so you mentioned the EU legislation, so if anyone in the audience who doesn't know, so in April, the EU issued some draft legislation regarding the regulation of AI systems and classifying them in these 4 different risk categories of unacceptable, high, limited, minimal, and putting this framework in place of what kind of safeguarding, what level of safeguarding and risk mitigation approach is required under each category. So Dave, from what you said, do you think that that's the right approach? Do you think that that's something which you think the UK should be mirroring or adopting, emulating?
I'm not sure if it's entirely the right approach, but the thing I do really believe in is that the UK is it's an excellent, or it's seen as an excellent partner in negotiating this sort of area. And standards, we're really, really good at technical standards in general. We're seen as okay, maybe people will tear me apart afterwards, but we're seen as playing fairly fair on that in that process. So we should be really engaged because it's going to be so important to so many of the companies based over here. And to be honest, I imagine probably in the US as well.
Yeah, so you've done the segue for me there. So Neil, where does what Dave said, how does what Dave said to resonate with your perspective of how things are in the US at the moment on this topic?
Yes, certainly from a regulatory perspective, I think we're seeing different regulatory regimes across the world, from the Australian standards that are coming out that are very outcomes based, to the recently released EU standards, which are very process based. If you follow the correct process, you are complying with their standards, to the US, where you have both standards being created by our National Institute of Standards, or NIST, as well as more department by department guidance, where you recently had the Deputy Secretary of Defense in the US come out with a robust, trustworthy AI paper. And so what you're seeing in the US is high level kind of standards come out from our standards bodies, and then application of those standards both at a state level, where you're seeing different states like California, like Virginia, come up and come up with their own kind of regulatory regime, to a federal answer where you're seeing different departments within government, like the Defense Department, like the Department of State, come up with their own guidance that's more formulaic based on these high level standards, but taking into account ISO standards that are coming out and looking at the way that it's being done kind of globally as well.
Do you think ultimately it will need to be something that's done at a sort of, well, I won't say global quite, but at a sort of federal level rather than a sort of state by state level?
Globally, I don't think that we've bottomed out whether we want to make our standards process oriented or we want to make our standards outcome oriented. And if we look at the different standards regimes that are coming around the world, we see about a 50-50 mix between the two.
Got it. So we've talked there about what sort of government's doing. I want to come on now to what the private sector doing, and specifically what you're both doing, what your companies are both doing. So without getting sort of too deep into the technical weeds, so tell us a bit about what you're both doing with CalypsoAI and with Advai to solve it. So Dave, if you can go first, give us an introduction to Advai and what your approach is in this space.
Yeah, so Advai is basically set up to proactively stress test AI systems. So we are looking at security, robustness, and fairness, and that goes from the data set through to the model itself. Our core technology is adversarial AI, which is the concept that you can manipulate an AI system using just the inputs, and we essentially use that as our basis for identifying the flaws and the problems. And referring back to what I said earlier, trying to take some of that burden off the data scientist and the AI developer to get that perfect, so that you can start identifying these issues of bias that are within your system, but also in the future looking at poisoning and how to address that. Because I think at the moment, if a poisoning attack was going on, it would be really difficult to identify it. You're in a space where there's so many different AI systems, so many different ways of approaching data and outcomes, that I think this is going to be a really big threat for the future.
Brilliant, excellent elevator pitch. Thanks, Dave. And then and Neil, the same question for Calypso.
Sure, really good question. So Calypso is just a little bit under 3 years old right now. we have the world's largest threat database in the adversarial machine learning space, and we're backed by the research of more than 30 scientists internally as well as externally. And fundamentally, what we focus on is end-to-end machine learning security. So from your data all the way to your deployment of models, taking into account our secure machine learning lifecycle process of ensuring that your machine learning models are robust. We work with multiple governments around the world. We work with a number of clients in the financial services realm. And fundamentally, what we're focused on is understanding the threat, mitigating the threat, and ensuring that as you're going and deploying your machine learning models, you can do so safely and securely, knowing that they're robust.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much for that, and obviously really excited to see how both your companies grow over the years to come. We've had a few questions come in from the audience now, which I'll turn to if that's okay. So firstly, a question about blockchain. So would blockchain help verify data for machine learning problems? Along with digital identity on the blockchain, I believe you could track whether data has been modified by third parties. Who wants to put their hand up for that one?
So I'm happy to take that one. Bjorn, that's a really, really good question. Fundamentally, the biggest issue with putting your data on the blockchain is for the benefits of blockchain technologies, it would need to be a public chain rather than kind of a private chain. And fundamentally, you'd be exposing sensitive data via putting your data on a blockchain. When we're thinking about our customers, whether they're in the healthcare space, the financial services space, or in the government space, exposing all of your data publicly isn't necessarily the grandest of ideas for them. And then when you look at exposing data on the blockchain longer term, as we have more and more advanced kind of homomorphic encryption technologies and decryption technologies in the future, it becomes easier and easier to decrypt any data on the blockchain, even if encrypted.
Great. Dave, is this an area you've looked into at all? Do you have anything to add, or we've got other questions I can move on to if not?
Yeah, we've theorized about it a little bit and looked into it, but I think Neil's covered a great deal of it. I think that's spot on, really.
Great, thanks both. I have another question from Harvey in the audience, who's asked, can our standards be both process and outcome oriented? Why choose one or the other? Dave, why don't you take that one?
Tough questions. I think so. I'm reluctant to come down on whether one should be we should go one way or the other. In practice, when you look at sort of like how regulations and sort of negotiations, particularly multilateral ones, go, it's just a give and take in each point, and you've got different parties come at it from different perspectives. So it might not be one or the other. I don't know. I think we've just got to let that process go through and have engagement from everybody where possible. I think it's just really important that as you do that, you have that engagement from industry as well as within governments and academia as well, of course. But yeah, I'm going to dodge that one completely because.
Neil, what would you add to that? You're going to dodge as well, or is there anything that would you come down on one side more, anything more decisively?
I think I'll do a partial dodge here.
Sure.
Fundamentally, standards are in the realm of government. It's our job as actors within this ecosystem to inform governments based on our lived experiences, based on what we know of the market, based on what we know of the threat surface, and to help regulators and policymakers make the best possible decisions.
Great, thanks. Another one that's come in, when using something like GPT-3, trained on huge amounts of data, is it possible to tell whether an output is due to standard model functioning, a result of data bias, or of adversarial attacks? Neil, why don't you have a first stab at that one?
Yeah, really good question. Conceivably, yes, it is possible to do so. The technical limitations really just come down to the amount of computation you need available in order to be able to generate any possible inferences from a model like GPT-3. And when we're talking about generating inferences, we're not talking in the low single digit thousands of dollars. We're talking in the realm of hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Sure. Dave, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it obviously you've got the element of can you get access to the original data set and things like that to go back through that's like chain. And the problem that you've got is that even when you find like what is there in something so vast like with GPT-3, it's going to be really, really tricky. I think, and the question is, how did that, like, was it an adversarial attack? Was that original data poisoned? And this is partly the problem when you've got something like GPT-3, where sort of like you get access to it, to the model, and you can use it and you can get the output, but you can't interrogate it all the way through. It's not the same as owning your own data set and your own model, where actually you've got far more control over it. So while it's an incredible achievement, I think there are some interesting questions around, like, what do you do if it starts going wrong? How do you interrogate it? And it might be that they've thought of that.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in what you said there about the sort of access to those data sets. I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative and ask a question of my own here, because it's something that we've worked with hundreds of security startups now at CyLon, and one of the challenges that spans many of them is how do they sort of build trust from potential partners, clients, and particularly when the systems on which they're working are business critical and also business sensitive. So in delivering what you both do, you presumably have to look quite closely under the hood in different ways of a company's systems, and perhaps into what many companies might consider their crown jewels. So are companies, or do you think companies may in the future be reluctant to give that kind of access? And do you think that will pose a challenge to sort of future efforts to assure technologies in this space? Neil, I'll come to you first on that one.
It's a really good question. For us, it really comes down to three things. One, the customer base that we work with currently and the trust in our technology that they put in currently and right now. Two, the fact that we enable customers to deploy on their premises or their cloud, enabling full end-to-end control of our technology. And then three, the fact that from an end-to-end basis, all the way to your report, we show you exactly what we do end-to-end, so you have trust in the inferences that we're giving you, because you can see what we did every step of the way.
Got it. And is it, Dave, is it similar story for Advai?
Yeah, I think so. Trust is going to be a huge factor, and it is in all of our relationships at the moment. One of our approaches is we don't create AI. That's been a purposeful decision from our perspective. We want to help and enable other companies to create better AI. We don't do it, to give some assurance around that IP element. I think ultimately, though, I don't know, it comes down to the sensitivity of what you're being involved in. So, for example, with government, if you're the MOD, then you would always ask for access to, say, a chip that's going into a platform. They will ask, or they will need to ask, for the same level of access to anything that is going within that is an AI system. And that's particularly, and this should be with commercial companies as well. I think it's going to be when you consider the elements such as transfer attacks, where actually if you've managed to control a data set, then you can train a similar model and it will have similar vulnerabilities to another system. So anybody that's procuring that AI system, they need to be looking or asking, what's happened to the data set? Where's that gone? Where did you get it from? Because it's things like that that are just as important. And you need to be able to interrogate those data sets as well. So I think there's got to be within that system some transparency. We can't just say, oh, it's a black box. That's not going to stand up to scrutiny in the future.
Got it. Thanks both. I'm sorry to say that we're coming to the end of our time, so I want to close with one final quick fire question, which is for all the people in the audience who I'm sure have had their interest piqued on this topic, whether it was something that they were familiar with before or not. But what would you say are the best resources for someone wanting to learn more about this topic? Any book recommendations, commentators, blogs, etc.? I'd love to get one recommendation from both of you. Neil, I'll come to you first, because Dave looks like he was thinking on that one.
Sure. Not to toot our own horn, but we're constantly publishing threat reporting. We're constantly publishing information about the state of the field, the state of the latest threat. And I would highly recommend checking out our 2020 State of the Union report on AI security on our website, CalypsoAI.com.
Great, thanks. And Dave? I will obviously plug advai.co.uk, and I connect up through LinkedIn, get in contact with me directly through the platform on CogX. We're always really happy to talk about this whole problem set. But the one book that I'll give a bit of a shout out, because this kind of converted us to adversarial AI in the very first place, was there's a book by Katie Warr, spelled W-A-R-R, who basically put a really nice sort of like book together about the actual technical aspects and the introduction to adversarial AI. And it's obviously basic. Sorry, Katie, if you're listening, but it's brilliant, really accessible. So if you're on the data science side of things, it's just a really easy introduction to the concept.
Brilliant, thank you. And that sadly is us out of time. So finally, just on behalf of CogX, I'd want to thank both of our speakers today, Neil and Dave, for their time and for sharing your views with us. I'm sure everyone in the audience found it as interesting as I did. Thanks you everybody for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.